there, my fantasy friends. I'm the Ragin' Redhead Cam Stewart from HotRoster today, and today I'm here to analyze the running back situation heading into Week 7. But before we do that, let's reflect on the wonderful week that it was. Both LeSean McCoy and David Johnson have been dominant this season, and this past Sunday was no different. The two backs both scored 3 touchdowns last week and notched 30 fantasy points apiece. However, I wouldn't predict a similar outcome for Week 7, even though Johnson looks like he's matchup-proof. He's facing a tough Seattle D. Shady McCoy also has a tough matchup, but you gotta roll with him on your fantasy team. The Bills are going to be in Miami visiting the Dolphins, who've allowed only 1 TD to running backs all season long. And sure, Shady might be the guy to break the trend this week, but McCoy has only scored in 3 of his 6 starts. So even if you have no choice to start him in fantasy, I'm going to take a pass on McCoy on any HotRoster card in Week 7. Meanwhile, Texans running back Lamar Miller and the Dolphins' J.H.I., they had unfamiliar performances for their fantasy owners last week. Miller did the thing we've been anticipating, the very thing we've been waiting for. He finally slashed and dashed his way to a huge day, thanks in large part to a Colts defense that struggles against the run. Plus, the great matchup allowed not only 1, but 2 touchdowns for Miller time, his first 2 of the season. And for those of you who drafted him in the first round, congrats, it finally paid off. Now, you might think Miller's matchup this week is going to be difficult as the Texans travel to Mile High Stadium to play the Broncos, but over the last 4 weeks, that Orange Crush D has allowed 20 fantasy points to opposing running backs per game. Plus, you got to think Brock Osweiler is going to be extra motivated to play against his old team, and you can bet he's going to lean tons on Miller. That's why I think Miller should be in for another great week. Meanwhile, in Miami, the unthinkable happened. J.H.I. of the Dolphins had the performance of a lifetime. His 204 yards rushing topped all running backs in the NFL this week, becoming the 4th player in franchise history to hit that mark. His play has solidified his spot atop the Dolphins' depth chart, ahead of Arian Foster, who is apparently still not 100%. What else is new? Big shocker, right? Foster dealing with another hammy injury. For that reason, I wouldn't be surprised if Ajayi holds down the starting role for the season. His biggest issue, though, is going to be consistency. And this weekend's game should be a true sign of what we can expect from Ajayi. The second-year back goes up against the Buffalo Bills at home, and Buffalo's defense has been great. They haven't allowed a running back to top 75 yards over the last 3 weeks, and I just can't bring myself to think Ajayi is going to be that guy to break the trend. So in this case, I'd avoid Ajayi and bet against him given the right matchup card on HotRoster. One running back that I'm loving this week and so far all season has been DeMarco Murray. The former Cowboy and Eagle has really hit his stride with the Titans. Over the last 4 weeks, they've constantly given him the ball. He's averaging over 25 touches per game over that stretch. This week, you have to think he's set to explode against the Colts, the same team Lamar Miller absolutely destroyed. They've given up over 100 yards on the ground to running backs in 5 of 6 games this season. Sunday, it shouldn't be any different. I'm rolling Murray in all my HotRoster cards. Anytime a team is set to play the Saints, one thing seems likely. New Orleans is going to give up 2 or more touchdowns to opposing running backs. It happened Week 1 when Latavius Murray struck gold. It happened Week 3 when Tevin Coleman had his way. And it also happened over the past 2 weeks with Melvin Gordon and Jonathan Stewart Sunday. It should be the Chiefs' turn and Spencer Ware's turn to shine. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about Jamal Charles? Well, last week was a cause for concern. At least for the time being, Charles was out-touched 26-11 against the Raiders. Plus, Coach Andy Reid confessed Charles isn't ready to be an every-down back right now, which leads me to think Spencer Ware will be the one making the most of his showdown against the Saints. Ware had 131 yards and a touchdown against the Raiders this past weekend, and I expect more of the same with the Saints in town. Don't be surprised if Charles tacks on a TD of his own despite his limited usage. That Saints D seems to be generous to running backs. Meanwhile, in New England, the Patriots finally seem to be dialing down the Bellatrix, and for that reason, fantasy owners should have plenty of confidence with James White. Since the return of Tom Brady, White has totaled over 150 yards and scored 2 touchdowns, while averaging 7 targets a game and outsnapping LeGarrette Blount 21-9 in the first half against the Cleveland Browns. White should continue to let the good times roll this week when the Pats travel to Heinz Field to play the beat-up Steelers. The so-called Steel Curtain has done a pretty good job against the run, holding most teams to under 70 yards rushing, but they've been burnt this season by pass-catching backs like Giovanni Bernard and Darren Sproles, who've both managed to tally over 100 yards receiving. I expect a similar back like White to share that same success and have a huge day. One guy who won't be having a huge day and who I'd avoid is the 49ers' Carlos Hyde. Sure, the matchup's there against the Bucs, who were cleaned up by Cameron Artis-Payne in Week 5. He had 85 yards and 2 TDs that week. But many might expect Hyde to bounce back from his horrible game against the Bills, where he rushed only 14 times for 54 yards. The problem with Hyde is he appears to have a nagging injury. He was even spotted at practice this week wearing a sling on his right arm. Plus, I got to expect the Bucs to try to stack the box and make Colin Kaepernick challenge them with his arm, so I would stay clear of Carlos Hyde this week. Lastly, there's nothing more than I hate in fantasy than a running back by committee, and these things seem to be popping off everywhere in the NFL. In Philly, despite rushing 9 times for 60 yards against the Skins, Ryan Matthews hasn't gotten more looks. He only played 11 of 52 snaps last week. That was one more than Wendell Smallwood. That's why until Matthews shows he's the leading member of this committee, I just don't trust him. Meanwhile, you might be inclined to trust Darren Sproles, but I wouldn't. The Eagles host the Vikings, whose defense absolutely suffocates teams, and they're coming off a bye. No thanks. Thursday Night Football will feature a series of committee backfields, and it's impossible to be confident about any of them. The Packers announced they're going to be without Eddie Lacy and James Starks. That's why they traded for Niall Davis. He might see some action, but with only 2 days to prep, I don't expect much from the former Chief. And you could go with Ty Montgomery against the Bears, but honestly, a wide receiver playing running back? Yeah, I don't like those odds. Pass. Meanwhile, the Bears' backfield is a mess of their own. Jordan Howard's snaps have gone down. He played roughly 70% against the Jags in Week 6, while fellow teammate Kadeem Carey outpaced him 50-34 on fewer snaps. That's likely to earn Carey a role and a timeshare of the Bears' backfield. That doesn't bode well for either guy this week. Well, that's it for today, my fantasy friends. Make sure you join us tomorrow when we forecast how wide receivers are going to do this week. And make sure you go to HotRoster.com and check it out. Download it, give it a try. It's like no other fantasy game you've ever played. Then check out HotRoster today with me and Gary and Thorne every weekday at 4:30 Eastern, only on the Fantasy Sports Network. For HotRoster now, I'm Cam Stewart, and I will see you on the virtual gridiron.